Today, we're tackling, well, a really fundamental part of society. The fascinating and, rapidly changing world of modern families and relationships here in the UK.
Mm.
And for those of you studying sociology, this deep dive is especially for you. We're aiming for a focused look at the key sociological ideas, the debates shaping how we understand this vital area.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll be drawing quite a bit from Modern Families and Relationships, a sociological view, which I know is a resource many of you might already be familiar with.
Right.
So think of this as us pulling out the core arguments, the key evidence, just to give you a richer, maybe more nuanced perspective on how we connect, commit, form families today.
Yeah, the goal is really to unpack the big shifts, how we
Yeah.
form couples, our choices around marriage or not marrying, how we raise kids, and crucially, what the main sociological frameworks tell us about it all.
Okay.
Okay, so let's dive straight in then. Coupledom. How has that landscape shifted?
Well, what's really striking is the dramatic shift in marriage patterns. If you compare it to 50 years ago, we're seeing roughly two-thirds fewer weddings. That's quite a drop.
Two-thirds. Wow.
Yeah. And when people do decide to marry, they're doing it much later. The average age for a first marriage is now, well, into the mid-30s.
In 30s,
Yeah.
so it really makes you wonder, what's driving that? Why such a big change?
Well, there are several key trends feeding into this. People are generally settling down later, often putting education and career development first. That's a big one.
Right, priorities shifting.
Exactly. And then there's the declining influence of religion secularization.
Yeah.
So those traditional religious expectations around marriage just don't carry the same weight for many people anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, with divorce being more accessible, easier than it used to be, that sort of forever promise of marriage might feel like a bigger risk, or at least a decision to be made later in life.
That makes a lot of sense. And alongside that decline in marriage, we've seen this real surge in cohabitation, haven't we? It almost feels like living together is the default first step now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really is. For many couples, it acts as a kind of precursor to marriage, maybe an extended test drive, you could say.
Yeah.
For others, it's actually the chosen long-term setup. And this rise, it reflects some pretty profound societal shifts.
Such as.
Well, women's increased financial independence is key. It gives women much greater autonomy in their living arrangement.
Right. Less economic pressure, maybe?
Precisely. And the social disapproval, the stigma around living together or even having children outside of marriage, it's significantly diminished. Massively so.
Mm-hmm.
And, some might view cohabitation as a more flexible kind of partnership, perhaps even a conscious move away from what they see as the historically patriarchal model of marriage.
Okay, so this is where we can start bringing in those sociological perspectives you mentioned earlier. How do they frame this?
Exactly. So from a feminist viewpoint, for example, this rise in cohabitation and later marriage can be seen as reflecting greater gender equality. It empowers women to make choices that align with their own goals, education, career, rather than feeling pushed into early marriage.
Okay.
Then you have postmodernist perspectives, which really emphasize individual choice, individual agency in forming relationships. People are less bound by tradition, more focused on finding personal fulfillment. But on the other hand, those aligned with, say, the new right, they tend to express concern. They see this shift away from the traditional married two-parent family model as potentially destabilizing for society.
So fewer people getting married initially, and as you mentioned, divorce is more common.
Mm-hmm.
For many who do marry, it doesn't last a lifetime. Let's get into the so-called divorce revolution.
Yeah, the numbers there are quite something. Divorce rates in the UK are roughly 5 times higher now than they were back in the early 1970s.
5 times.
5 times. And some projections suggest that around half, maybe even slightly more, of new marriages might eventually end in divorce.
Wow. So what's driven that dramatic increase?
Well, we can kind of categorize the reasons into 2 buckets. Things that made divorce more available and things that made it more acceptable.
Okay, availability first.
Right. Legally, things changed hugely. The big one was the 1969 Divorce Reform Act. It introduced irretrievable breakdown as the sole ground for divorce. That was a real watershed moment.
Simplified things legally.
In essence, yes. Also, the availability of legal aid, for a time at least, reduced the financial barriers for some people. And crucially, equal rights meant either partner could initiate the proceedings, not just the husband.
Okay, so the legal doors opened wider.
Oh.
What about the acceptability side? Why did it become more socially okay?
Well, social attitudes just changed dramatically. Divorce isn't the huge social taboo it once was. Far from it. Again, secularization plays a role, weaker religious objections. And Uh, Drawing on Anthony Giddens' work, there's this idea of rising expectations for relationships, this concept of pure love, that's intense emotional connection.
For a relationship, yeah.
Exactly. And when that intense connection fades or isn't deemed fulfilling enough, individuals might feel more justified, more inclined to end the marriage and perhaps seek that connection elsewhere.
And how do the different sociological schools of thought interpret this rise in divorce?
Well, functionalist sociologist Ronald Fletcher, for instance, argued back in the day that it wasn't necessarily a rejection of marriage itself, but rather reflected higher expectations. People demanded more love, companionship, intimacy.
So divorce happens when marriage fails to meet these higher expectations.
That was his argument, yes. Postmodernists, on the other hand, tend to see high divorce rates as almost a natural outcome of our individualized society, where personal choice and self-fulfillment are paramount. And then there's a more sort of structural point, increased life expectancy. People are living longer, so marriages just have more time, statistically speaking, in which they could potentially dissolve.
It's not just about the start and end of first marriages, though, is it? Family structures are changing after relationships end, too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Remarriage is much more common now. It accounts for about a third of all weddings.
A third. Okay.
And this naturally leads to more blended families, or step families. They now make up around 11% of couple households with dependent children.
And you mentioned stepfathers are more common.
Yes. Interestingly, stepfathers are more prevalent than stepmothers. This often reflects the typical post-separation living arrangements, where children usually live primarily with their mother.
And then there's this other arrangement, living apart together, or LT relationships. That seems quite distinct.
It is, yeah. These are couples who see themselves as being in a committed relationship, but they choose to maintain separate homes.
Why would couples choose that?
Well, sociologist Lynn Levin identified several reasons. Sometimes it's about existing obligations, maybe caring for elderly parents or children from a previous relationship. Practicalities can play a big role too. Things like established careers in different locations or mortgages tied to separate properties. And for some, especially perhaps after a difficult divorce or separation, it might be about avoiding the perceived risks or constraints they associate with cohabitation or marriage.
Sort of keeping a level of independence.
Exactly. And this idea resonates quite strongly with Giddens' concept of the pure relationship again, where the focus is primarily on the emotional connection and individual choice, rather than being bound by traditional legal or economic ties, or even shared living space.
So the landscape of coupledom is clearly complex and evolving. What about parenthood? How are patterns of having children changing alongside all this?
We're seeing really significant shifts there, too. Generally, families are smaller than they used to be.
Right, fewer children per family.
Yes. And women are, on average, having children later in life. Plus, there's a noticeable increase in the number of individuals and couples who are consciously choosing not to have children at all, voluntary childlessness.
What's driving those trends? Later motherhood? Smaller families?
Several factors are intertwined. Increased opportunities for women in higher education and careers often lead to delaying childbirth.
Makes sense.
Then there's the sheer cost of raising children. It's incredibly expensive, often estimated at around, what, 200,000 pounds per child up to adulthood?
Wow, yeah, that's a huge financial consideration.
It really is. And linking back to what we discussed earlier, that broader trend of individualization means personal lifestyle choices, travel, career focus. These are often highly valued and sometimes seen as competing with the demands of raising a family.
And another really striking statistic you mentioned in the outline was the rise in births outside of marriage.
Yes, that's a big one. Nearly half, close to 50% of all births in the UK now occur outside of marriage.
Nearly half.
Yeah. But it's crucial to understand what that means. This figure includes children born to couples who are cohabiting, living together, but not married, as well as children born to lone parents.
So it doesn't just mean lone parents.
Not at all. A large proportion are within stable, cohabiting relationships. The really key takeaway, sociologically speaking, is that the social stigma, the shame that used to be heavily associated with having children outside of wedlock, has largely evaporated.
Which leads us nicely into the topic of lone parenthood itself, because the numbers there have also increased significantly, haven't they?
They certainly have. Lone parent families have actually tripled since 1971. They now represent about 1 in 4 families with dependent children in the UK.
1 in 4. And mostly headed by mothers.
Overwhelmingly so. Around 90% of lone parent households are headed by mothers. There are various contributing factors. Post-separation custody norms often favor mothers. Sadly, instances where fathers desert the family, and also the choice some single women make to become mothers through routes like IVF or sperm donation.
And there are definitely some strong often contrasting sociological viewpoints on lone parenthood.
Oh, absolutely. Very polarized sometimes. From a new right perspective, for example, the increase in lone parent families is often viewed with concern. They tend to link it to worries about a dependency culture, supposedly encouraged by the welfare state, which they argue can contribute to wider social problems like crime or educational underachievement.
That's quite a critical view.
It is, and it contrasts sharply with feminist perspectives. Feminists often argue that these kinds of criticisms directed at lone mothers are frequently rooted in outdated patriarchal assumptions about family life.
Right.
They emphasize that most lone mothers manage incredibly resourcefully, often in difficult circumstances, and that many didn't actively choose lone parenthood. It's often the result of relationship breakdown or other factors beyond their control. They'd argue the focus should be on support, not blame.
It's certainly clear that the idea of the traditional nuclear family, married parents, couple of kids, is no longer the only or even maybe the main way family life is structured.
Exactly. What we're witnessing is a much broader, more diverse range of family and household structures.
Hmm.
Dual learner couples are now pretty much the norm, not the exception.
Yeah.
We see more beanpole families, structurally long and thin, meaning multiple generations are alive, but with fewer people, like siblings or cousins in each generation.
Interesting term, beanpole families.
Yes, isn't it? It captures that vertical structure. We also see the importance of chosen families, close networks of friends who provide the kind of practical and emotional support traditionally associated with biological kin.
Mm.
And of course, there are significant variations in family life based on ethnicity, social class, and even region. Plus, that phenomenon of boomerang kids, adult children returning to the parental home, often for economic reasons.
So all this diversity, what does it mean for those older sociological theories?
Well, it directly challenges the kind of claims often made by functionalists or the new right, the idea that there's one single best or correct family form, usually the traditional nuclear family. The sheer variety of functioning, caring family units we see in everyday life really undermines that notion.
Okay, so moving beyond just the structures, sociological inquiry also looks at the nature of personal connections themselves, right? The meaning behind them.
Precisely. That's where the interactionist perspective comes in. It shifts the focus away from just structures and statistics toward understanding the meanings, the interpretations that individuals attach to their close relationships.
So not just marriage or family, but friendships too, even pets.
Absolutely. Friendships, relationships with pets, even connections to significant memories or objects, interactionists look at how we define and experience intimacy in all these different ways.
And this links to the individualization thesis.
Yes, exactly. The individualization thesis, particularly associated with sociologists like Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens, highlights how traditional norms and rules that used to govern relationships, who you should marry, when, how you should behave, have become much less rigid, less binding.
So relationships become more about choice.
Very much so. They become more fluid, more chosen, more actively negotiated between the individuals involved based on achieving personal happiness and fulfillment, that pure relationship idea again.
But there are critiques of that idea too.
Oh, yes. Sociologist Carol Smart, for instance, offered a significant critique. She argued that this idea of completely free, unconstrained choice is a bit overstated. Our choices, our relationship pathways, are still heavily shaped, or at least influenced, by factors like our social class background, our gender, our ethnicity.
So structure still matters?
Exactly. Structure and social context still constrain choice. And Smart also emphasized that biological ties, blood relationships, often remain incredibly significant and important to people, perhaps more so than the pure individualization thesis might suggest. It's not all just fluid choice.
Right, a more nuanced picture. Finally, we can't really talk about families and relationships without touching on social policy, can we? It plays such a huge role.
Absolutely fundamental. Social policy both influences and responds to all these changes we've been discussing. If you look at the history in the UK, say, from the post-World War II welfare state onwards,
Yeah.
well, the welfare state initially aimed for quite broad, universal support for families, based on a particular model, perhaps. Then, the Thatcher era in the 80s saw a shift, influenced by new right ideas, towards reducing state intervention, promoting the self-reliance of the nuclear family.
Less state support, more individual responsibility.
That was the emphasis, yes. Then you had things like the 1989 Children Act, which was really focused on safeguarding child welfare, clarifying parental responsibilities irrespective of marriage. But New Labor in the late 90s and 2000s adopted more of a third way approach They sort of acknowledged family diversity more openly, but also put a strong emphasis on tackling child poverty and promoting employment, especially for lone parents, through initiatives like Sure Start centers.
Right, I remember Sure Start.
And then more recently, under the coalition and subsequent conservative governments from 2010, we saw, well, a bit of a renewed focus on policies explicitly aimed at supporting marriage, alongside wider austerity measures that significantly impacted funding for many family support programs.
So a real back and forth in policy approaches. And what about sociological critiques of these policies?
Well, there are many. Jacques Donzelot, for instance, made the point that social policies, while often presented as neutral, can actually result in greater surveillance and regulation of working-class families compared to middle or upper-class families, a kind of policing of the poor. And feminist critiques have been consistent over decades, highlighting how many policies, even when we have equal pay laws and anti-discrimination legislation, still seem to operate on an implicit assumption of a male breadwinner and a female caregiver homemaker.
Even now?
Even now, arguably, in the way some benefits are structured or parental leave is organized, this often doesn't reflect the reality of dual-earner couples or the diverse ways families actually function today.
Okay, so pulling all of this together then, especially for our sociology students listening, what are the key takeaways, the big picture insights?
I think there are a few core themes. Firstly, it's undeniable that legal and cultural changes have dramatically expanded the range of choices people have in how they form, maintain, and indeed end relationships. There's just more perceived freedom.
Right, more options.
Secondly, economic shifts, particularly women's greater economic participation and independence, alongside shifts in gender norms, have fundamentally reshaped traditional marriage dynamics and family roles. Thirdly, that broad trend of individualization we discussed puts a much greater emphasis on personal choice, negotiation, and achieving emotional fulfillment within intimate relationships. It's about what works for the individuals involved.
Okay.
And finally, the state, through social policy, plays this ongoing, often contested, role in shaping family life. Its approach to family diversity has fluctuated and continues to be debated, reflecting different underlying political and social ideologies.
It's clear that looking at families and relationships in the UK today really does give you a fascinating window onto these wider societal changes, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a core area of sociology for a reason.
And on that note, maybe a final thought for everyone to ponder, especially our sociology students, thinking about all these trends later: marriage, cohabitation, diverse families, individualization. How do you think intimate relationships and family structures might continue to evolve over, say, the next 20 years?
Good question.
What new sociological questions might emerge? Questions about intimacy, about care, about social connection, social cohesion. We'd really encourage you to, take these sociological lenses we've talked about and apply them to the relationships you see around you, maybe even in your own lives.
That's the real value, I think, seeing the sociology in the everyday. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the sociology of modern families.